Well, good afternoon and welcome to this session called Provocatively After Democracy. It's also after lunch, which is the traditional slot where you have to keep people awake as they settle in, but I can see no sign of falling asleep yet, so let's hope we keep you stimulated. This discussion on democracy versus oligarchy comes up a lot in my life in the form of the debate of India versus China. And I think that particular contrast probably tells us that it's not absolutely straightforward, that we might instinctively say democracy, gosh, yes. If you ask someone in China what they think of India, they say, well, do a lot better if it wasn't a democracy. And so, there are different perspectives. And I think that, as we look around the world, we also perhaps will address the question here of whether these are really two absolutes, whether they shade into each other, whether they morph into each other. Can oligarchies serve only themselves, or can they serve the wider interest? Can they be elected? Can they be, as it were, democratic oligarchies? And indeed, is there an ideal political framework for every country at every moment, in every situation? Well, we're very well equipped, I think, to chew this over here for you this afternoon. Robin Dunbar's an Oxford psychologist. Bonnie Greer, I'm sure you all know, playwright and critic. David Aaronovitch, Times columnist and eminent commentator on all matters. And Simon Glendinning, philosopher from the LSE. The format is, as in other sessions, that each of the speakers is given a very generous 3 or 4 minutes to lay out their position. And then we will have a discussion here, and then we will open it up to a discussion with you, the audience. So without further ado, I'm going to ask David to kick off and perhaps address himself to the opening question, which is, is democracy overrated?
The short answer to the question is no. I was brought up in a political tradition, and so I'm trying to write about now, in which the term democracy was always prefixed by real or bourgeois. Bourgeois democracy was the kind of democracy that we have in the West. Not actually real democracy at all, but just where you were allowed to go to the polls once every 4 or 5 years. Nothing very much was permitted to change, as compared with a vision of real democracy which might exist at some point in the future, but the harbingers of which already did exist in places such as the Soviet Union, Eastern European countries. True, they had made mistakes. True, they occasionally used administrative measures when they should use political ones to deal with dissent. But nevertheless, the varieties of methods that they chose to consult their people were in some ways superior and certainly not inferior to those that we had in the West. That was the political. So any number of excuses could be dreamed up to adduce to why it was that actually our system was not as superior as we like to present it as being, and their system was not as inferior as the bourgeois press, another arm of the bourgeois democracy and so on, were insistent on painting it as being in their kind of crude way. I hardly need to tell you the series of upsets that came along in order to disturb that picture of life right the way up to and culminating in 1989. It's amusing to me, therefore, to see almost the same sets of thoughts being contained in discussions about, let's say, China versus India and so on. That actually the Chinese are better off without a democracy. They're not a state at all. They're something else that don't require a form of democracy. The democracy is not being required in order to be a condition for economic success, and that actually, in any case, there are a whole series of problems to do with our own democratic form. And all I would say is this. There is an unpleasant way in which those states we excuse for not being as democratic as ours, there's an unpleasant habit they seem to have about dealing with such matters as people who disagree, people who want to say something that the state doesn't like, renewal. They hadn't seemed to have a series of other problems associated with that which are difficult because they're difficult for them to deal with, such as corruption and so on. And finally, just to make the bully point, since we're sitting here in a tent at the moment, the historical moment that we are, one of the things that you did not get people calling for in Tahrir Square was oligarchy. You did not get them saying, please bring in an enlightened oligarchy, that's the system that we would like to see, or you did not see them waving pictures of Hu Jintao and saying China is the country whose way of consulting people we would like to emulate. Is democracy underrated? Ask them in Egypt.
Thank you very much, David. I think we know what David thinks now. I'm going to the other end of the platform to ask Robin to address the same issue.
I guess I'm kind of find myself in a little bit of a dilemma here, because I don't like the idea of oligarchy, but I'm not sure if what we do with democracy is actually workable. And the kind of point I'm going to make, I think, is that our social world is so small scale that it's almost impossible to get beyond that to have a real large-scale democracy unless you do it somehow differently to the way we do it. And one of the key, I mean, that's partly because our social world really is very small scale. Typically, most people only have good relationships with, or anything like a relationship with, about 150 people. There's a limit on the number of people whose faces you can put name to at about 1,500, and beyond that, it's just a blur. And it kind of seems no surprise to me that then what happens when we vote in democracies turns out to have very little to do with politics or anything else. They're kind of almost gut instincts of small-scale society. And just to give you two kind of exemplars of that, there's the infamous and well-known case, well, why did Obama win against McCain? McCain lost even before he started on both of these two counts. One is he was the shorter, and the other was he was the less symmetrical. So there hasn't been hardly, well, it's not quite true to say there hasn't been, something like 3/4 of presidential victors in the last century in America have been the taller of the two candidates in the final runoff. And I think it runs at a 2-to-1 majority in favour of the taller over historical time, and that includes periods, obviously, when in the 19th century it was difficult to get both candidates on the same platform together. Indeed, notoriously, when they've had a very tall candidate like Bush and a very short opponent, they've raised and lowered the lectern so they didn't make them look obviously smaller. The symmetry one is much more subtle. However, it's turned out from some colleagues of mine from up at Liverpool, well now at Stirling, who looked at the facial symmetry of major candidates in all the last century's American elections, all the last century's UK elections, and similarly the New Zealand elections. And out of that, they were able to predict the winners very, very well. In fact, on the 2005, I don't know whether they tried it this last time, but on the 2005 election, they predicted a 52% voting split in favour of Labour, and I think it was 53% they predicted, 52% was what it actually was. So it kind of looks like we're not choosing, I'm sorry to say, in our democracy, our leaders on the basis of politics or anything ethereal and so on like that. We're actually picking them on rather gut instincts about how much we like them and so on. So I kind of worry that whatever we do is just going to be imperfect. It's going to lead to oligarchies one way or another, whether you call it a nominal democracy or not. I think if I were asked to specify something more specific, I would go for a kind of Swiss-type system where you had a series of layers of elections. So you elected your representative in a very, very local base who went on to a sort of higher level, let's say county parliament, and they in turn elected people from within them. So that would seem much more representative to me and perhaps give more control. It's just a possibility anyway.
So democracy, an imperfect system, and then a whole new twist on you look taller on television as a kind
Yes.
of right. Simon.
I'd like to pick up on something that was mentioned at the beginning by David of the distinction between real and bourgeois democracy, and perhaps rather unwisely, I'm going to use my first time talking at this panel to present two opposing views, neither of which I agree with. The two texts that I'm going to read very short paragraphs from. One deeply wants an after democracy. The other thinks that there is nothing beyond the democracy that we have, liberal democracy in a liberal market economy. So the first one is saying democracy is not the end of history and we deeply need something else which is to come. And the other says, no, we've arrived at the end of history and democracy as we have it is the end. Now the first one is from a revolutionary socialist anti-capitalist blog, and it goes like this. For too long we have been told what is and what isn't possible. Late last year the British cultural critic Mark Fisher published a book entitled Capitalist Realism that discusses neoliberalism's propaganda project, its insistence that there is no alternative. This message has been hammered into our collective consciousness so consistently for so long that we have come to assume that capitalism is our only option, that it constitutes our reality, and we find it difficult to imagine anything else. Fisher reminds us of the quip made by both Frederick Jameson and Slavoj Žižek that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. So he thinks we're in that position, and it's really a terrible situation that we've come to where we can't imagine an alternative. Now he's almost quoting, but not quite, from a text from just after the end of communism event, the fall of the Berlin Wall, by Francis Fukuyama, who says this: "We, who live in stable, long-standing liberal democracies, face an unusual situation. In our grandparents' time, many reasonable people could foresee a radiant socialist future in which private property and capitalism had been abolished, and in which politics itself was somehow overcome. Today, by contrast, we have trouble imagining a world that is radically better than our own, or a future that is not essentially democratic and capitalist. Within that framework, of course, many things could be improved. We could house the homeless, guarantee opportunity for minorities, improve competitiveness, create new jobs. We can also imagine future worlds that are significantly worse than we now know, in which national, racial or religious intolerance makes a comeback, or in which we're overwhelmed by environmental collapse. But we cannot picture to ourselves a world that is essentially different from the present one and at the same time better." So there we have two views on the impossibility, or at least extreme difficulty, of imagining a different, better world. Now, I think both of those are wrong. I think that the right way to view democracy is to think that there is, in a certain way, no end to democracy. That what we, as it were, should be striving after is not an after democracy, nor an affirmation that the end of democracy has arrived. Democracy, for me, by granting free speech, free assembly, free press, an electoral calendar in which each voter counts one, where the possibility of change in government is never excluded, this form of political organisation is the only one, I think, that calls for its own critique and admits to its own revisability and an openness to challenge in its current space of possibilities and institutions. In other words, it contains within itself a kind of promise for infinite perfectibility. Things could be better at every stage, as it were, without end, and without, importantly, a final form of perfect adequacy. And this means that democracy, on that conception, is always something to come. Today, as it were, it is to come. And I'll finish with a third quotation, this one from the French philosopher Jacques Derrida, who puts it like this: "This doesn't mean that democracy to come will be simply a future democracy correcting or improving the actual conditions of the so-called democracies. It means, first of all, that this democracy we dream of is linked in its concept to a promise. The idea of a